So today's topic, disarming the debate of photo manipulation. Now, this is something that I put an email out yesterday to the readers of Everyday HDR, asking them one question, and that was, does photo manipulation degrade the integrity of a photograph? If so, how? So I was expecting a lot of responses, but I wasn't expecting nearly as many responses as I got. But what I found was that there's a very strong divide between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. So as I go through this little slideshow, I'll go ahead and talk about these things that are unacceptable and unacceptable, acceptable and unacceptable, and then I will get into how you can create a, I guess, acceptably manipulated image, if that makes any sense. Okay. So this is nothing new. This has been going on for as long as photography is old. So we're talking late 1800s, maybe even before that. So this is something that this debate has always been there. There's been the purist and the artist. Are you an artist? Or are you a photographer? Is this a photograph, or in this day and age, is it digital art? Back then, it was just considered regular art. Is it an art form or a photograph? So I've gotten into a lot of discussions with what they call a purist, and if you have ever run across a purist, you know them when you see them. They will say things like, this is what happened to me at a gathering of photographers. I was doing a presentation. At the end of it, this gentleman said, "I don't like your work," and I said, "That's fine. Can you please elaborate? Because I want to know." I take constructive criticism very, very strongly, and I appreciate that. And he said, "Well, it's not pure. It's not a photograph anymore. It's art. It's not a photograph." And I said, "Well, this is a photographic depiction of the scene that I took." He said, "Yeah, it's a photographic depiction. It's not a photograph." So we went on this battle back and forth, and at the end of it, I said, "Well, how do you feel about Ansel Adams?" And he said, "I love Ansel Adams." I said, "Okay, I appreciate your passion and your enthusiasm with that response, but do you realize that he is one of the kings and the fathers of what we have of modern-day post-processing?" And it just kind of ended the conversation with a gentleman who was very upset and just kind of left. So straight out of camera. You see a lot of people pride themselves in straight out of camera. This came straight out of camera. I love it. It didn't even have to do any processing to it. And I have my thoughts on that. So these are Blake's thoughts, all right? So I hope I don't upset anybody here. And if I do upset someone, maybe I'll get you to think. But when someone says, "I took this straight out of camera," and I say, "Okay, was it JPEG or RAW?" And they say, "It was JPEG," my immediate thought is this: fast food apple pie. It's straight out of camera, but it's straight out of camera as a JPEG. And what I mean here is that it's a ready-made. It's already done for you. You go somewhere, you pick it up, and you eat apple pie. And the analogy here is that straight out of camera JPEGs, the camera's doing a lot of stuff for you while it's compressing that photo. It's doing noise reduction, it's sharpening the photo, it's doing some lens correction, maybe some saturation, contrast adjustment, chromatic aberration. There's all kinds of things that your camera is deciding to do for you when you get it straight out of camera. So is that pure? There's always some type of manipulation that's happening, whether it's straight out of the camera as a JPEG, or, like I like to consider, straight out of camera for RAW. So again, these are my thoughts. This is a RAW file. If someone says, "Hey, I got this straight out of the camera, RAW file, didn't even need to do anything to it," I'm immediately thinking, okay, so you just brought me all of the ingredients to make an apple pie, but you haven't made me an apple pie yet. So you've got the material there to make a great product, because some people make better apple pie than others. My wife makes excellent apple pie, mine are horrible. So you have the ingredients to make something, because the camera is not doing any of the following. The camera, when you shoot RAW, is not doing noise reduction, not sharpening, not doing lens correction. It's not doing saturation, contrast adjustments, or chromatic aberration reduction. That's all left up to you, and those are things that you should address. So here, let's look at this. Photo manipulation, JPEG. It comes out of the camera manipulated. RAW does not come out of the camera manipulated, so the only true image, I guess, would be a RAW file. But then you have to consider some other areas, like what lens was used, because that's going to be a manipulation, whether you used a wide-angle lens or a telephoto lens, whether you're on a tripod or you're handheld, all those things, angles, you can manipulate a scene from a different angle. So even before the image comes into your computer, you can manipulate it. Real estate photography, I do it all the time. I don't want this part to be in the room. Guess what? I'll just make sure it's not there. I'll take it from a lower angle or a higher angle. or I'll remove that one piece of furniture from this area so that this photograph looks better. So what is acceptable? And this is the general consensus that I received from all of the emails, and I did my absolute best to respond to every single one of them. I think the only ones I didn't respond to are the ones that maybe have slipped through into the spam folder. It took me like 7.5 hours to get back to all the emails that I got. But here's acceptable and unacceptable. Cloning out distractions, that's acceptable. Unacceptable is plastic skin in portraits. So you can clone out those zits and those pimples, but don't make plastic skin. That's unacceptable in the terms of manipulation. So this is acceptable in the manipulation standpoint. So let's just look at the ones that are bolded here. When it enhances the photograph, it is acceptable. When it degrades it, it's unacceptable. When there are global changes, it's acceptable. When they're unacceptable, it's detectable changes. So if you didn't fool the viewer, then it's unacceptable. But then you have the other flip side. If it's for artistic purposes, it's acceptable. So you have to let people know when you're going to be doing this. And then there's unacceptable, if deceit is the intent. Really where the line is drawn here between the people that I've discussed this with is that if you're doing documentary or historical based photographs, it's unacceptable to modify the image. If you're doing fine art photography, the sky's the limit. So what's the in-between? What's the gray area? And that's where we get down to when it's beautiful, it's acceptable. And when it's overdone, it's unacceptable. And those are all subjective to who we are as artists. Now, not just you have the subjectivity of the artist photographer, you also have the subjectivity of the viewer. Now, let's say that the viewer is also a photographer, then you're just in a world of chaos. So that's going to lead me to what are we going to do today with photo manipulation. So here's the original RAW file. I chose this file for a reason. It's a RAW image taken 2 years ago from my Olympus E30 camera. So this is a 12 megapixel camera. I had a very, not a very strong wide angle lens, maybe a 24 on there, and it's in a garage of a car. Now there's some things on here that would be acceptable changes and unacceptable. So this is what we're going to get to. So we've enhanced the image, we've done some color, some tone, so on and so forth, and this would be considered too much. All right. Now I know what you're thinking. You're like, get that off my screen, because I'm thinking the same thing. But at the same time, I'm going to show you that there are some things in an unacceptable image that can make an acceptable image. All right. So let's just go ahead and jump into this, and then we will get to the fun stuff here. All right, making the unacceptable acceptable. So looking at this photograph, I know right off the bat, because it's a RAW image, that it's going to need some noise reduction. Right? We talked about that. Noise reduction has to happen on a RAW file. So we're going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and we're going to go to Denoise. So when we get into Denoise, I'm just going to go ahead and reset all of what was in here before. What I'm really looking at here is anything in these deep shadow areas and anything back here, kind of just if you look at it, it doesn't really appear like noise. It was ISO 100, but even on my Olympus E30 in a dark room, you still had some noise. So I'm going to go ahead and go to RAW and go to moderate. Now, what I love about Denoise is its ability to keep the detail in my photograph. So it's keeping and holding all of those details true without just blurring the entire photograph. And you know, I've done a lot of noise reduction in the past, and what I really enjoy about Denoise is the fact that it ensures that my detail stays intact, especially if it's done, let's say, I guess, tactfully. All right. So one of the things that you can ensure that you're doing it tactfully and acceptably, I guess, if we're going to call it that, is to move the overall strength up. So if you move the overall strength up, you're getting into that kind of painterly noise reduction that doesn't really look acceptable. So if we zoom out a little bit here, you will see, let me just fit this to 50%, that it kind of looks like a painting now. So if we just move that overall strength back to where it was, to the more acceptable range, there are some things in Topaz Denoise that make it a lot more powerful than other processing software. I don't know why I'm stuck in like this really bad loop here with Denoise. Okay, there we go. What I like about it is you can go into the different luminance modes of your photograph, and you can see in a luminance value where certain areas might need more noise reduction than others. So if I zoom in here into the shadowy areas, I can always increase the amount of noise reduction on just the shadows independently from the rest of the photograph. You can also do that over the different color channels. So in this photo, I'm not seeing it too badly, but there's the red and the blue. So if you click on these will show you areas in your photograph where red and blue noise are existing, so that you can come down here and you can adjust the red and blue color noise. Now, there's not a whole lot of that going on in this image, so I'm not too worried about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and press OK and leave this the way it is. What I really wanted to show you here is that detail can still be held true in Topaz denoise without blurring the photo. It's not a blurring type of noise reduction. It's a very smart noise reduction. So the next thing I want to do is I want to jump into Topaz Adjust. And the reason why I want to go into Adjust next is because that is where I can really accentuate the overall look of the photograph. Now, to me, this does not look anything like I saw it. And here's another debate that I've had even with a couple people via email now, and there's nothing wrong with that. The debating is the great part about this, because we're learning about photography together. But the fact that a single image cannot and will not at this point in our lives be able to show you what my eye saw. Now, there's also that subjectivity as to, was it my eye that saw it or my mind that saw it? But the deal is that your eye can pick up, especially if it's in a room for quite a bit of time, it analyzes the scene and it looks at the photograph, so that, or the scene, so that it can accept all the different light areas. You see the areas of dark, you see the areas of light, so that as you pan across as a scene, you don't have to constantly adjust the shutter speed of your eye. All right, but a camera can't do that. It can only take one impression or one snapshot of what it is that you're looking at. So you get one instance of light based on a light-sensitive capture. One instance, that's it. It doesn't analyze it. It doesn't see exactly what you're doing. So what I like to do is use things like HDR to go ahead and further accentuate what it is that I saw. Now, this is not the garage that I saw. This is not the Model A that I saw. I saw something a lot more spectacular than this, but the single photo cannot and will not be able to bring that out. So what I like to do is do this tastefully. Now I'm going to show you how to do it untastefully or unacceptably, like we've seen, and how to do it to the point that it's acceptable. This, in the higher regions of adaptive exposure, is unacceptable. And there are many reasons why one would consider this unacceptable. And for many reasons, if you look at it, we're getting some tone compression, the saturation looks horrible, our darks are turning into lights, our lights are turning into darks, and it doesn't really work. Now, as an artistic piece, if you wanted to do this, fine. But now you've just broken that realm of what is a photograph and what is digital art in the form of a lot of people's minds. So what I'm going to do is move the adaptive exposure up pretty high. I like to bring that up pretty high, but then with the regions, I'm not going to go so high with the regions. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the regions are, if you were to divide your photo into, let's say if you have this at 4 or 1 region, it's just one big overall adjustment with your adaptive exposure. Then when we move it up, it starts to divide your photo into segmented areas where that adaptive exposure is adapting itself to the region that you're applying it to, or the multiple regions you're applying it to. So we'll go ahead and bring that up to 22. So what this does for me is that it opens up my areas of shadow, similar to what my eye would see if I sat in this room for a long enough period of time. But it doesn't get to the point that it blows it out and makes it unacceptable or unreal or surreal, I guess, if you want to call it that. So with contrast, I'm going to go ahead and bring the contrast up a little bit. I'm going to bring it down a little bit, see exactly where I want to be. Usually, this is how I make my edits. I just move it up, move it down until my eye really likes what I'm looking at, and that's going to be about right here. So here's the before, here's the after at this point. Now the protect highlights and protect shadows, I'm going to bring those all the way down to 0. So just so you know what that looks like, if we bring it all the way up, you can see that when we bring that protection all the way up, it's not really allowing our highlight areas to blow out. So what we get here in these highlight areas, like down here, is tone compression. Our highlights now look like muddy shadows, because we're protecting them so much. Well, if you bring that down, it allows those areas to blow out. What I like to say is let a blowout be a blowout. If that area is supposed to be blown out, let it blow out. Okay? Specular highlights happen all the time. And then shadow, we're going to leave that down. Now the details, we don't need to get into the detail in this too much. I'll do that later. Now with color, this is not a representation of the color that I saw when I was in there. The green of this Model A is actually a very beautiful, nice, shiny Model A, and what happens is I'm starting to get a degraded color. So if I bring up the adaptive saturation, it's very similar to the adaptive exposure. It adapts itself over the different regions that you apply it to. So I'm just going to move this up to about 8 regions. Not a whole lot. All right. So with the saturation, here is where you get into another argument, saturation. You know, some people are like, whoa, that looks totally cool. And that's usually the people who have just discovered the saturation slider. And I'm raising my hand right now because I was one of those people. When I first found out that I could make my photos look like this, I made like 150 photos look like this, and then I never showed anybody. I locked them up in a cage and I made sure that they never got out again. And it's just that excitement that you can see things that you've never seen before in your photographs. You boost the saturation, it looks great, but guess what? That's overdone, it's unacceptable. So we'll just go ahead and bring that to about here is good. So we get a decent amount of saturation. We've opened up our contrast. We've addressed contrast and color at this point. But I'm going to further address contrast, and that's where I'm going to get into Topaz clarity. So I'm going to go ahead and, before I get into clarity though, there's some things I want to fix here because I've heard that this is acceptable now. I keep playing that joke, but really, if you've got distractions in your photograph, clean them up. You know, this is my grandfather's garage. This is his Model A. This is the Model A that I grew up looking at over years of my life. And I know that he keeps his garage very nice. And this leaf here, I don't know how that leaf got there because it normally wouldn't be there. There's a little cap under the car. These are things that I want to clean up. So I'm just going to zoom here, and I'm going to go to the clone stamp tool. Now, one thing I want to tell you about the clone stamp tool is that you can use it on a separate layer. So if you go up here, you want to go to sampling and you go to all layers. And why do you want to use the clone stamp tool on its own layer? Well, I'm going to show you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an area from here. What I don't want to take is an area that has one of these spots in it, because watch what happens. That spot is now duplicated. Let me do that again. So if I do that over and over and over again, and then I zoom out, look what you're going to see. A whole series of repeating patterns. If you see repeating patterns, your eye is immediately going to pick up that that person did an unacceptable clone stamp job. But if you do it to the point that it's acceptable, nobody will know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click right here. I'm going to grab this area, and I'm just going to start cloning this area out, ensuring that I don't grab anything that might create a repeating pattern. Now look here. I grab that. 1, 2, 3. 3 spots. Okay. Now I'm going to grab here and click there, grab here and click there. So now you can kind of tell that it's still there because I see a repeating pattern here and here. So if I just grab a little bit more from here and cover that one up, we should be okay. One of the things I want to show you though is that if by chance this doesn't really match the rest of it, what I can do is I can create a new adjustment layer. I didn't want to put a mask there. I can create a new adjustment layer, a curves adjustment layer, create a clipping mask. What this clipping mask is going to do, when I press Alt or Option and click between curves and layer 1, that's now going to apply a curves layer just to the area that I applied my stamp to. Okay, so watch what happens. See how I move my curve and my clone stamp area gets a little darker, a little lighter? This is how you can make your clone stamps blend perfectly with the area that you're trying to clone. So that now, because I've made that modification, you can see a difference there, that it looks a little bit better than it did before. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this leaf out of here, and one of the ways I'm going to get the leaf out is just go to the patch tool, and I'm going to use a different tool this time. I'm just going to grab this leaf. With the patch tool, I'm going to work on the background layer. I'm just going to move this over to here and see what it does for me. So what it's going to do is it's going to try and make the best possible adjustment it can so that that spot matches this spot over here. But what you see when it does that, it makes it kind of dark, and it doesn't do it very well. So what I can do is just make a new layer again and go to the clone stamp tool and kind of clone that area out a little bit, make it a little bit bigger, and try not to get any repeating patterns there. Okay, if I do see a repeating pattern, I'll just take a smaller swatch from somewhere else. And yes, you should be doing this when you're clone stamping things out. And the last thing I'm going to clone stamp out is this little guy right here. And I'll just grab a spot from right here and then just clone this area out. Now the reason why I didn't do those clone stamps on the same layer right here, because then this curves layer would be applied to those areas, and I don't want that. All right, so I'm just going to slam all this together and press Control Shift Alt and E. Actually, I'm going to just Control Shift E, which would be Command Shift E on a Mac. Slam all those together because then I'm going to move forward into Topaz Clarity. So why I showed you that is because if you're going to make a clone stamp and you're going to be cloning areas, it's very important that you don't show areas that have repeating patterns. And there's a story behind this. My wife and I were about to get married, and we went to a wedding photographer, and they were telling me just about how great they were at Photoshop. And I said, oh, let me see some of your Photoshop work. And they showed me this picture. And I said, oh, well, you just clone stamped somebody out of here and tried to put a new chair there. Like, how'd you see that? Nobody's ever seen that before. I said, because one of your chairs is missing a leg. It's got 4 legs. There's only 3 on that chair. So if you're going to try and pass something off on somebody, then you got to do it right. And I do agree with people there. There's some unacceptable things that people do with their images. So now I'm in Topaz Clarity. And what I love about Clarity is it allows me to open things up even more in the individual contrast areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move the micro contrast up. And the micro contrast, by moving that up, is basically going to add more contrast. And contrast is a fancy word for the difference between light and dark in a photo. So it's going to make all the small details in my photograph have a higher contrast or a higher ratio between light and dark. It's kind of like the difference between dynamic range, but slightly different because they make sliders for it, I guess. So what you've seen here is as I move that up is the image is getting an overall more, I guess, HDR grunge type look. But what it's doing to me is it's showing me things that I actually saw more in that image. So I'm going to move the low contrast up, and then I'm going to go ahead and move the micro contrast up. And for now, I'm going to leave the high contrast alone, and I'm going to open up the histogram and look at the histogram. Because this is where, when I'm adjusting these sliders, it's starting to tell me things. And what it's starting to tell me here is that, hey, your blacks are really clipped. Now, a lot of times you'll hear me say, let data be data, let blowouts be blowouts, and looking at a histogram, you can also say, let the data be data. But what the data is telling me here in a blaring way is, hey, you've got some contrast issues here because you're clipping your blacks so much that basically these areas are unacceptable. All right. So how do you make that more acceptable? Well, here's our histogram. This is the black portion of our histogram. This is the white portion of our histogram. So if I move the black level to the left, I'm moving my histogram further and further to the left and making this more and more unacceptable. All right. If I move it to the right, I'm starting to move that histogram more towards those black clipped areas. I'm starting to open up those areas more. If I move it all the way over, you can see that those areas that were now clipped now have no information there because there's no black there or very little black there. So what you do is you kind of use these tone level and dynamics in the same way. So when this is kind of like tone mapping. It's very much like tone mapping because you're looking at all these different contrast areas, and this is giving you many more options. In my opinion, I like Topaz Adjust because of what Adjust does, but I love Topaz Clarity, especially when it's used with Adjust, because you can make some killer looking, I guess if you want to call them pseudo HDR images, but there's no such thing as a pseudo HDR image. As long as you're increasing the dynamic range of a photograph, you're essentially making a high dynamic range photo. All right. So if we move the black level farther to the right, we can open up those areas of black. But now you see what's happening to the white level. Well, if I move the white level to the right, I'm going to force my histogram to the right. If I move it to the left, I'm going to force my histogram to the left. And each one of these adjustments up here in the contrast area does the same thing. So you see how you can come up with unlimited combinations between dynamics and tone in Topaz Clarity. So I'm going to make a bold statement. Out of all of the Topaz software that I use, my absolute positively favorite one that I can't live without is Topaz Clarity. All right, put it on the record. I said it. Another reason is because there's an awesome hue saturation adjustment layer in here that gives you red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, purple, magenta, and overall. Now, one of the things that we talked about were chromatic aberrations. Well, what the heck are chromatic aberrations? Chromatic aberrations are those areas in your photograph where you start to see magenta and cyan show up kind of on opposite sides of each other. So sometimes you'll see a magenta tinge here and a cyan tinge here. A lot of times, chromatic aberration happens based on the lens that you use. If you use a wide-angle lens at the lowest possible focal length, you're going to see a lot more chromatic aberration because with the chromatic aberration it's the way light kind of bends inside the lens, bounces around the lens, and goes and gets recorded on your sensor. Okay, so look right here at the top of the grill. You're going to see that magenta kind of tinge there. I can go into the hue saturation of just the color magenta and knock it down, and do the same thing in the purples and knock them down. Now I don't have the chromatic aberration that's happening in the chrome. A lot of times when you're photographing cars, you're going to see this. It's the chrome that is very difficult to render because it gets rendered with all these different nasty blotches of different color. Okay, you can go into luminosity of those colors too. So let's say with purple, I want to make those purples darker. I just move that to the left and make those purples darker. If I want to make them brighter, I move it to the right. That way you can easily blend those areas together with what they should look like in their area around them. That's a simple way of doing chromatic aberration adjustment. But what you're going to see here is when I move out and I do that what's called globally over the entire image, there's going to be certain things in this photo that are going to be sacrificed because of that. And that's anything in this photo that had purple or magenta in it. Well, there's some things back here on the toolbox that have purple and magenta in them. There's some tools up here. There's some backings to some boxes. So what I can do is just go into the masks here, and let me go into the mask, and I can hide anything up here with my color. Oh, I selected the wrong mask. It happens to the best of us. I selected the mask for clarity and not the mask for my hue saturation. But that's a good thing to note, is that in clarity, there's two different types of masks. You have the mask for the adjustments that you did for your color, and you have the mask for what you did in the contrast. So now I can go ahead and hide what I did with my color, because all I did in my color was my chromatic aberration. So if there's anything in this photo that had those colors in it, I can revive them specifically by their colors, completely separate from the tone, which is great. It's great to have those two separate masks in there. And now I'll press OK, and I'll open this up. So looking at this photograph and looking at the original, I'll show you the original in a second here, there's a certain area that I want to bring back. If I look at the original photograph in the very beginning, there's this nice light spray that's happening in this photograph that I'm completely missing. And one of the ways I can bring that back is I can duplicate this photo, press Command-Control-J, go to Filter, and go to Blur, and go to Gaussian Blur, however you want to pronounce it, and just press OK. Now what that's going to do is it's going to blur the entire photograph. But when I set this to something like Overlay, you see how I start to get this nice spilling of light in here? Now it's affecting my color as well. So I'll bring this down a little bit, and I can put a mask on it. Now what this is it's kind of like an overlay glow. It just gives everything that's being hit by it a certain glow. Obviously we're going to need to make a mask on it. So I made that mask there, and I'll just paint this out. So kind of give me that glowing effect where the light is spraying in on this area. So if I turn that off and turn it on, you can see that that area on the right-hand side is just kind of glowing a little bit. It's starting to bring back what my eye actually saw because there is a window right there. So I'll let that spill in and I'll let it glow. Another thing I want to do is add another layer here. And I'm going to paint this white. I'm just going to do a white streak right here. And then what I can do is I can turn this to just take my opacity and drop it down a little bit. And that gives me that same kind of effect. All right. One of the other things I want to do here is because my color temperature is really blue, I want to add a color filter to it. But the color filter I'm adding to this, I don't want it to affect my highlights. This is where things get really fun. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to make a photo filter. And I'm going to make a warming filter that is the color yellow. So with this being the color yellow, I'm going to go up here. So now I've got this overall nice warm, or I guess more yellow temperature to the overall image to kind of give it that vintage garage look, all right? But I don't want it to be affecting my highlights. So I'm going to select my background, and I'm going to go to Select, I'm going to go to Color Range, and I'm going to select Highlights. Now this is the beauty of Photoshop. I love Photoshop for this reason. So if I go to that mask, I can press Shift F5 and fill that mask with black, and that is going to segregate my highlights from the rest. Now, what it's doing is it's only doing that for the highlights. It's basically saying, hey, all highlights, you're not going to get this overall temperature effect. And you can see it in the lights. Look at the lights. So if I take that off, those lights are yellow. If I put it back on, those lights are nice and white. It protects my chrome. Now, that might be kind of confusing. So what I did was I made an action for this. So if you go to the website after this, there's the overlay glow. That one's there. That's going to be your overlay glow. There's a soft light glow. There's also a dodged highlight warmth. If I press play on that, it's going to go ahead and open up a new layer, and it's going to do all of that work for me. It's all done. I don't have to worry about it. I've got a nice warm layer here. If I press and hold shift, I can drag that and drop that right back onto my working copy, and I can just go ahead and delete this. So it works right in there with your workflow. You don't have to worry about it sandwiching anything down. So now we've got this overall, what I would call, complete photograph. We've kept it within the realm of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in terms of photo manipulation. And in my opinion, we've gotten us closer to what I saw. Now, what I saw is subjective to me. What I'm going to show you, I'm press Control Shift Alt and E, make an overall layer on top of this. I'm going to go to Filter, I'm going to Topaz Labs, I'm going to go to Adjust. And with Adjust, I'm going to go ahead and make my overall global adjustments really high. Adaptive exposure, push my regions up, go into my detail, bring my detail up, make this all nasty and grungy and disgusting. Because what I was told in college once was to make a bad painting. I had no idea how to make a bad painting because I had made, in my opinion, good paintings. So here I'm making a bad photograph. And when you look at this, you say, okay, what's bad about it? All right, we really don't have a clear and present idea of what's black and what's white anymore because everything's flat and on the same plane. How do we know that? We can go to our curves adjustment layer and we can see that. Look at this curve. It's a really interesting looking curve. That's the perfect bell curve. So when people say you're striving for the perfect bell curve in your pictures, you can show them that, hey, sometimes the perfect bell curve is not the best idea for your images, all right? Now, if we go and we make a curve here, you can see that we've got a nice, we've got a bunch of different information in our highlights, our midtones, our shadows, and that's the curve for everything that was below that stamp that we made. So what else is wrong with this? The color's all wrong. Well, what you can do with this is what I found out in that painting class. My professor said make a bad painting, and I said you're crazy. I've never made a bad painting before. How am I supposed to make a bad painting? You know, there's that high and mighty kind of feeling that you get there. So what I did was I researched things that I didn't like. I didn't like Jackson Pollock. So I started doing some Jackson Pollock stuff, and what I found out was that I really liked some of the stuff that Jackson Pollock did. I really enjoyed his process. I never appreciated it before because I'd never done it. Well, once I made a bad photograph like this, you can start to appreciate it because you've done it, all right? There's some things about this that actually work. Let's change this to luminosity. So we've got a bad photograph. We change it to luminosity. Well, while it would be a bad photograph, look at the certain things about this that I actually like. I like the detail that it's giving the tires. Tires look like that. Tires are worn. Tires are never perfectly, beautifully black. It doesn't work that way. They roll, and they roll on the ground, and they pick things up. What's on the ground is dirt, all right? So I'm going to bring that detail back. So what I can do is I can make a mask on this bad image. I can invert that mask, so now I don't see anything. And then I can brush in certain areas that I want to see. I'm going to brush in with white. I'm going to bring those areas back. So I like the detail in those lights. I like the detail in the grill. I like the detail in this chrome. Now we can get some true chrome. You know, there's a lot of people out there that photograph cars. You want true chrome? You want some beautiful chrome? Go ahead and do this kind of stuff with it. Don't make it all milky and clean because that's not what chrome usually looks like. All right, so let's make those tires nice and dirty because we're bringing back certain areas that we liked in that other image to give this more detail, all right? And then maybe these tools back here. These tools are kind of cool with that dingy, dirty look to them. Maybe the countertop here. Maybe even some of this wood. Just to kind of bring in certain elements from the bad photograph that actually make this a little bit better. Now, if it's too much, we turn the eyeball on and off. We can see that it's way too much. We can drop the opacity a little bit, maybe to about 55, 60%. And we can see that it's actually helping the photograph. So sometimes what's unacceptable can be acceptable. All right? So don't get yourself too caught up with, am I doing things right? Am I doing things right? Just do them how you want to do them because this is your work in general. And the only thing you really have to worry about is if the viewer is a photographer, all right? And a picky photographer at that. So would I say that this photograph has been enhanced or degraded by what I did? I personally would say it's been enhanced, but that's up to the viewer. It's completely up to the viewer. So let's take a look at another thing that a lot of people had a discussion about when I was talking to them about photo manipulation. One thing they talked about was people. So here was the photo that I came up with in the end. Now, this is a photograph for my wife, and she wanted something that she could use on her business profiles and so on and so forth. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and shoot you. And not shoot, that's a photography term for, I would never do that to my wife. That's a photography term for, let's take your picture, okay? So I took her picture in the basement. Over here you can see one of my soft boxes. You can see one of my umbrellas over here. You can see a picture frame in the background. Do you want to show that on a business profile? No, you want to show that on the background that you had. So what I did was, in one of the past webinars, I showed how you could turn a texture into an impressionistic style looking backdrop, and that's pretty much what I did to the background here, and I put her on top of it. One of the things that people discuss as what's unacceptable is plasticky fake skin, and I agree with them 100%. But at the same time, sometimes the lenses that we choose show us things that we don't need to see. Now, when I look at my wife, I don't see the hairs on her face. I don't see the pores in her face. But when I have a full frame camera with a 50mm lens blasting her face, I get all of these nitpicky details that I don't or nobody would really see. So do you want fake plasticky skin? No, you don't want fake plasticky skin, but you want it to work right. So a lot of people would jump into Topaz Clean, and Topaz Clean does a good job of cleaning up faces. But one of the things that I found, especially when I was putting this together, was I was looking at Topaz Detail. And if you've ever seen me use Detail before, I'll just go ahead and make a duplicate of this. So I'm going to Command-Control-J, duplicate my background, and just so you know, there are actions for this too. Right here in this actions folder, there's going to be a skin smoothing and a detail sharpening action. It's going to do all of this work for you. Okay, so it's already done. It's not like I want you to brain dump this stuff. I just want to make your life a little bit easier. Life is better when it's easier. There's the easy button for it. Those are called actions in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and go to Detail. So I'm opening up Detail, and one of the things that I talked about in Detail, every time I use Detail, is that I boost up the strength of the details, especially the small details, and then I pull back the boost. So I increase the details and I pull back the boost. And that's to kind of round off those details, because when you increase the boost, you get this really hard edge to your details. So if you increase the small details and decrease the boost, you get this nice detail boost with softer edges. Well, what happens if you just leave your small details alone and just drop the boost? Well, when you zoom in here, you start to see that it softens the skin. If we go to the medium boost and drop the boost on that, it starts to soften the skin. And it does it in a very naturalistic way. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and press OK on this because I know that it's not done yet. What I like to do is I like to over smooth, and then I'll show you how I fix that later. So I'm going to over smooth this. So her face is definitely over smoothed at this point. When she was watching me put this together, she's like, "Are you really going to do that?" I said, "Babe, don't worry about it. Just, let me do my thing, all right? Let me do my thing." So what I did was make a mask here and press Command or Control I on that mask to turn that mask black. So now what you want to do is you want to paint on that mask with white to bring anything back that you want to be smooth. So I want her forehead to be smooth. I want the top of her nose to be smooth. I want this area to be smooth. I don't need to see pores. This does a nice job of smoothing out wrinkles. Now, we don't want to lose wrinkles because wrinkles are characters to people's face. And I like to call my wrinkles dignity. That's my dignity. Don't take my dignity away from me, okay? If you're taking my picture, you better leave my gray hair and my wrinkles there, because I deserve my gray hair and my wrinkles, all right? I've lived a long 32 years to get those. I can't wait till I'm like 60 and have a ton of them. So I'm going to do the same thing with her skin, so you don't get that kind of chicken skin look on the neck that we normally get, especially if it's a little colder in the studio. So now that looks pretty naturalistic, but I'm going to drop the opacity a little bit on that so it's not so blaring. So now we've got this nice smooth skin. Looks like she might have a little makeup on, but that's more natural to the way I would see her from a distance, not the way my lens saw her. So now what I'm going to do is press Command or Control J and duplicate that. So let's just go ahead and go to Filter, go to Topaz Labs, and go to Detail. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this, and I'm going to go into my small details, and I'm going to increase my small details. What I'm doing here is I'm not looking at the overall photo. Don't look at the overall photo. This is where we're going to make hair and eyelashes kind of stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to increase that a little bit. When it comes to portrait photography, it's all about the eyes and what you do with the eyes. And if you make those sharper and look a little bit more, punchy, it actually works. So I'm going to press OK. Basically, just increase those small details. What you're seeing here is what's underneath this layer. So if I turn this off, that's what overall happened to the overall image. But remember, this is where we smooth the skin. So this is smooth, and this is detail. So what I'm going to make here is another mask. Make another mask. Press Control-I to invert that mask, and paint with white on areas that you want to bring back. And those areas would be like eyebrows, just kind of paint them back a little bit. Eyes, eyelashes, those kind of things. Lips, the little creases and crevices in the lips, and then also hair. So you can do the same thing for hair, and just go ahead and increase the detail in that hair. So here's the before. Here's the after. It's subtle. It's acceptable. That's acceptable. I didn't make her skin look like plastic. I just smoothed it out a little bit. I didn't liquefy her skin. My wife is beautiful. She doesn't need to be liquefied. All right. I would never do that to someone who do want to be liquefied. It sounds like something out of a horror movie. I would never do that. But in the end, what I ended up doing was putting her on a background with Topaz Remask and use Topaz Impression to make that overall background. So those actions are in here. When you press play on this, it's going to say right here, say actions below are for portrait work, but you must own detail. So if you don't own detail and you try to press play on this, it's not going to work. All right. So when you press play on this, it's going to go ahead and duplicate your work that you're doing. It's going to smother it all down, and then it's going to say, okay, I've already done everything I need to do. Paint in white on those areas that you want to bring back. So if I paint in white, that's going to further smooth her skin even more than it was before. And then if I press play on this one, it's going to go ahead and select my background layer, duplicate it, it's going to run detail on it, and now I can bring back some of those detail areas. If I'm going to paint with white on the mask and not on her, if I paint with white on the mask, I can make some of those areas more detailed. Now obviously that's over detailed and over smooth, but I just showed you that I did all those exact things in 2 seconds. So what it comes down to for me, and these are kind of my final thoughts on this, is that this is one of my favorite images. As a matter of fact, as a photographer, as an artist, whatever you want to call it, my passion is through education. I like educating people and showing them that they can do what I do. But a lot of times I end up shooting just for the sake of how I can further educate someone. With that being said, I don't get a whole lot of personal attachment to my own photographs. This is the only photograph that I've had a personal attachment to, and there's a reason why. I took it back in 2012. It was before I wrote my first book. It was kind of the start of my career. It was one of the very first photo walks that I ever had that was successful. I took this image of a 6-foot-tall tree. I laid it on the ground, took a picture of it, and as I started editing it, I started to realize that when I took this picture, I took it for a reason. And the reason why I took it was I felt like a small fish. I still am a small fish in this giant sea of people that do cool things with Photoshop. I'm a very, very small fish. But at the time, I was even smaller. And I was taking this small tree. I was making it look like something that it wasn't. I was making it look larger than life. I manipulated this tree from the beginning. If you look at this tree, you think that this tree is 17 feet tall. As a matter of fact, it might be maybe 7, pushing 8 feet if it's lucky. All right? But the way I laid down, I exaggerated the angle to exaggerate the image, and then in Photoshop, I started to get certain feelings toward this image that made me feel like something big was going to happen, and that's where this comes in. So is this a manipulated photograph? Certainly it's manipulated. Does it still look like a photograph? Yeah. A lot of people, when they look at this, I printed this out on metal, and they're like, wow, how did you capture the sun at such a perfect time of day? Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't. But if I sat there long enough, I could have gotten this shot. And that's the whole point, is that if you can add a sky to further emphasize the beauty of the scene, do it. It doesn't necessarily mean put a lake in the Grand Canyon where there certainly is no lake. That, to me, would be unacceptable. But if the sky enhances it, go for it. Don't really worry too much about this purist mentality. Don't worry that you're over-manipulating something or you're not doing something right. Just do it. Do what feels right for you.
Thanks so much for that presentation. Thanks so much for everyone who joined today, and have a great day. Bye, everybody.